So, what if our entire understanding of consciousness, of what it means to be a self, was just incomplete? We're about to get into a wild story about a scientific discovery that started with one single confusing piece of data and ended up changing everything. It revealed that for some people, consciousness isn't a fixed state of being, but a constant, flowing state of becoming.
And this quote? This is from the person right at the center of it all, Miriam Okoye. As a few brilliant scientists were about to find out, she wasn't just being poetic. No, this was a literal, dead-on description of a whole new kind of reality. Let's dig into how they figured it all out.
All right, so here's our roadmap. We're going to follow this thing all the way from a weird, flickering signal in a lab to the birth of a new identity, a civil rights movement, and, believe it or not, a brand new way of building our world. It all started when one scientific paper gave a name to a hidden group of people and forced us to question the very foundation of society.
Okay, let's set the scene. Our story kicks off with a researcher named Dr. Keiko Sato, and she's just staring at her screen, looking at data that, by all accounts, should not exist. The data was from Subject 7731, a woman named Miriam Okoye, and her results were throwing every known model of the human mind right out the window. Now, you have to understand, at the time, science had this all figured out. Or so they thought. Most people have what's called singular consciousness. Think of it like a unity scale. You score high on that scale. You've got one stable, unified I with a nice solid line between you and everything else. It's consistent, it's predictable, and it was pretty much considered the default for a healthy mind.
And then you had the flip side, plural consciousness. On that same unity scale, these folks scored low. For them, the self is more spread out. The boundaries are more permeable. It's more of a we than an I. But here's the key thing. Both of these states, singular and plural, were thought to be stable. You were one or you were the other. End of story.
But then there was Miriam, and just look at these results. She wasn't singular. She wasn't plural. She was somewhere in the middle, and not just sitting there. Her consciousness was constantly oscillating, swinging back and forth like a pendulum in this perfect rhythmic wave. This wasn't a glitch. It was a pattern nobody had ever seen before.
And that's when it finally clicked for Dr. Sato. This was her big breakthrough. Miriam wasn't changing from one state to another. The change was her state. She wasn't in the process of becoming something else. Her fundamental nature was the process of becoming.
So Sato, along with her mentor, the absolute legend Dr. Sophia Almazan, they wrote it all up and published their findings. The paper was called Threshold Consciousness, and it did way more than just introduce a new theory. It gave a name and a voice to a population of people who had been living in the shadows, and it kicked off a revolution.
This chart right here really shows you how huge this shift was. I mean, look at it. The old model said transformation was just the messy bit between two stable points. But the new threshold model, it says the transformation is the point. The stable state itself is the act of changing. It completely flipped the fundamental idea of consciousness from a static state of being to a dynamic process of becoming.
And the reaction was, well, it was immediate and it was intense. On one side, you had the academic establishment, guys like Dr. Harrison Webb, who just completely dismissed it. They called it a pathology, said they were glorifying instability. But on the other side, for thousands and thousands of people, it was like a light bulb went on. The Threshold Beings Collective just exploded because people finally had words for what they'd felt their entire lives.
This quote just nails it. At the very first big gathering, Miriam Okoye got up and reframed their whole existence with this one perfect line. What the world saw as a failure to be stable, they now understood as a profound success at being dynamic. But this powerful new identity was about to smash head-on into the world around them.
So, finding your people is one thing, but living in a society built on the assumption of stability, that's a whole different problem. People quickly started running into what they called the threshold ceiling, all the ways the world just wasn't built for them.
And yeah, things escalated incredibly fast. First, it was about jobs, people getting fired for not being stable. Then it got scary, medical AIs failing to diagnose them properly. Then their basic freedoms started getting chipped away, like being banned from smart traffic grids. In just 3 years, it went from a scientific paper to a full-blown civil rights movement.
And this wasn't some abstract philosophical debate. We're talking about the real-world systems that run our lives. Hospital AIs, traffic grids, even the neural banking systems wired into our brains. They were all designed for one kind of user, a predictable one.
For a threshold being, this meant the world was constantly screaming error at them, flagging them as a security risk, or just shutting them out completely.
So, just as the conflict was hitting its peak, a totally new problem emerged from inside the movement. Critics started saying that being threshold was just a trend, that people were jumping on a bandwagon. And this pushed Dr. Sato to launch a massive new study, one that would uncover an even deeper, more complex truth about consciousness.
And what she found was, frankly, groundbreaking. It turns out threshold consciousness wasn't just one thing. It was a whole spectrum. You had your core threshold beings, like Miriam, who'd been this way forever. But then you also had emergent beings, who developed the trait later in life, and even contextual beings, who only shifted in certain environments. It wasn't a neat little box. It was a vast, flowing continuum.
This new, richer understanding didn't magically solve everything, but it did change the conversation. People stopped arguing about who was really a threshold being and started asking a much better question. How do we build a world that actually works for everybody, no matter how their mind operates?
The answer was a total shift in philosophy, from static design to adaptive design. Instead of building for the average person, designers started focusing on the edge cases. They figured out that true resilience doesn't come from rigid consistency, it comes from flexibility. And this led to this cool phenomenon called threshold diffusion, where solutions made for a few people started making life better for all of us. And that was the incredible unintended consequence. All these innovations they created for threshold beings, things like adaptive interfaces and flexible architecture, they turned out to be better for everyone. By designing for a mind that's in constant motion, we accidentally built a world that was more forgiving, more resilient, and just more human.
But the story doesn't end there. Of course it doesn't. A new generation of kids started growing up in these new adaptive environments, these threshold zones, and they began to develop consciousness in ways that nobody, not even Dr. Sato, could have predicted.
They started calling themselves the pattern dancers. And get this, for them, transformation wasn't something that just happened to them. It was something they could do. They didn't just ride the waves of their own consciousness. They learned how to steer them, how to choreograph them, to literally make art out of the flow of their own minds.
Which brings us to the ultimate lesson here, and it's summed up perfectly by the late, great Dr. Almazan. This whole incredible story taught us that we were asking the wrong question. We thought consciousness was a map of places to discover, when really it's a wide-open ocean of what's possible.
And that kind of leaves us with one final thought, doesn't it? If our most fundamental state is actually a state of change, if being is really a process of becoming, it makes you wonder, what parts of your own life are in motion right now? What are the thresholds, big and small, that you're crossing every single day?